Hello, everyone. Welcome to World Affairs and the Global Philanthropy Forum. I hope you're all safe and healthy as we enter a second year of the pandemic. I'm Ray Suarez, co-host of the World Affairs podcast and Washington correspondent for Eurovision. We're recording today's conversation for broadcast on our radio program, which airs on KQED every Monday evening at 8. So if you have questions you'd like me to ask, please use the chat feature in Zoom and send them right to me. Today's discussion will focus on the future of food and farming. Our guest is Robert Paarlberg. He's been a member of the Board of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the National Research Council, a member of the Board of Directors at Winrock International, and a consultant to the International Food Policy Research Institute, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's written many books about food policy, including Starved for Science, Food Politics, and the United States of Excess. His new book is Resetting the Table, Straight Talk about the food we grow and eat. And this is a topic of deep interest to me personally. Like many sons of Brooklyn, I didn't see much growing while I was growing up. A few Italian neighbors lovingly protected fig trees to nurse them somehow through the New York winter. Some of my fellow apartment dwellers conjured up tomato plants from half milk jugs on the fire escape. But to see food being grown, I had to go somewhere else. And a lucky life as a reporter has brought me to meet farmers in southern China, in beautiful Andean potato fields at 13,000 feet. I've been to cotton fields in the Nile, ridden in the cabs of enormous high-tech combines with farmers on corn and soybean farms in Iowa and Illinois, and hung out with some of the poorest people on the planet in Lesotho in southern Africa, who were growing white asparagus for export to Germany and the Netherlands. What did I learn? The economics, science, design, fashion, fad, and flavor of what's gone into your mouth so far today is incredibly complicated and not easy to change, because long chains of relationships between farmers and markets and seed companies and inputs and middlemen each put in their pull in the global tug of war over food, and we, the eaters, are just holding on to one end of one rope. My guest has spent a lifetime studying these questions. I was kidding with the staff earlier this week when they asked about his book, Resetting the Table. And I said that the real subtitle should have been, Everything You Know About Food is Wrong. Robert Paarlberg joins me now. Welcome to World Affairs.
Thanks, Ray. It's wonderful to be here and have a chance to speak with you.
I was joking, of course, but are there, in your view, some serious misconceptions about food? How it's grown, how it's processed, how it's marketed, how it gets into our kitchens?
Yeah, more than a few. I decided to write this book after attending an event at Harvard University on sustainable food. And the panel consisted of a celebrity restaurateur from the Bay Area, a playwright from New York, and the leader of the slow food movement in the United States. And they all reached a judgment that sustainable food would have to be organic, local, and slow. And those are popular beliefs. But I had just returned from a research trip to rural Africa, where I'd been interviewing Ugandan farmers, women farmers. And I knew that they were already living in a world that was de facto organic, local, and slow, and it wasn't good for them or for their children. They didn't know it. They were living the Harvard dream, but they were impoverished and their children were frequently undernourished. So I decided to write a book that would push back against some of these popular notions.
Pretty much right out of the gate, you throw down the gauntlet to your reader and defend so-called industrial farming. So let's start there. On a big spread where commodity crops are grown, you can see them throughout the Midwest. Those are sort of the bad boys of American farming, certainly in the minds of the people like you describe on that panel you were sitting on. But what's gone right about the way Americans produce food?
Well, you have to keep in mind the quantity of food that the market now demands and the increased quantity of food that we're producing today compared to the 1930s and the 1940s before we had an industrial farming system. We're producing 3 times as much agricultural products in the United States today as we were in 1940. If we had tried to produce that much using the traditional methods of the 1930s and the 1940s, we would have done far greater damage to the environment. Already in the 1930s, we'd reached the limits of what traditional agriculture could provide. We'd expanded cropping into the drought-prone southern plains. And when we had a drought, the soil blew away and we created a disastrous dust bowl. Fortunately, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and right up through the current day, we've introduced a number of technical innovations in agriculture that have reduced our dependence on land, on water, on chemicals, on energy, and of course on labor as well. People don't realize it, but all that corn you see when you drive through the Midwest, we're producing 5 times as much corn now as we did in 1940, but on 20% less land. We're using a technology to increase yields on the land that's already been plowed so that we don't have to plow more. Compared to 4 decades ago, we're consuming 18% less pesticides. Compared to 1972, we're applying 90%, no, more than 80%, not quite 90, but more than 80% fewer insecticides. Energy use on farms is way down since we've gone to no-till farming. We don't have to burn as much diesel fuel. If we hadn't introduced these industrial scale innovations, it would have been impossible to produce the food that the market has demanded without doing much more damage to the environment.
Is most, some, just a little of the corn you see when you drive southwest out of Chicago towards St. Louis on the interstate being grown for people to eat?
Well, of course, a third of it goes for auto fuel because we have a renewable fuel standard that mandates the production of a certain amount of corn-based ethanol. Another portion of it, another 15 or 20%, is exported. Much of the remainder goes for animal feed here in the United States. Only a small amount is for direct human food consumption. It's primarily a feed crop and an industrial crop around the world. Soybeans, primarily a feed crop. We use the land for what it produces best, and for the fruits and vegetables that we can't grow in the winter months, or for the tropical fruit products that we can never grow, we import those from abroad. One of the points I make in my book is that what Americans eat isn't the same thing as what farmers grow. You have to look at exports and imports to understand the relationship between what farmers grow and what consumers eat.
Well, you and I are both old enough to remember when you just couldn't eat certain things during certain times of year. And you might even look forward to a certain time of year because you associated them with the availability of some well-loved fruits. Whenever I'm in a supermarket now and I pick up a plum in January, and I see a sticker on it that says that it came from Chile, I have to think twice and sometimes a third time about the efficiencies of a farmer on the west side of the Andes with a plum tree, getting his plum somehow to Valparaiso, I guess, which is the seaport, and then that boat going 12,000 miles to a port on the west coast of the United States, and then that plum getting on a truck probably a truck, I guess, or maybe even if it's a high-priced plum, a plane. Does it really make any sense? Wouldn't it have been okay for me to just wait till June to have the darn plum.
Well, Americans don't eat enough fresh fruits and vegetables. If you didn't allow us to import these very healthy products, particularly off-season, America's diet would be worse than it is already. We don't eat enough of these products. If you tried to grow them all in the United States, the price would be so high that our consumption of these products would go down and our diet would be worse than it is. I don't think we should be anxious about the fact that food travels a long distance. If it travels by ocean freight in a refrigerated container, for every single plum that we get, the carbon footprint is minuscule. It's not how far food travels that determines its carbon footprint. It's the mode of travel. It's the load size. We probably do more damage to the atmosphere for every tomato we consume by driving 10 miles to a farm stand and getting 8 tomatoes and putting them in a paper bag and putting them in the back seat of the car and then driving home 10 miles. Per tomato, we're burning much more fossil fuel than we burn importing using modern transport technologies in bulk loads.
Well, the plum, okay, I'm not going to destroy the planet by eating that plum. But I wonder about things that can be grown in temperate zones that we've simply moved away from out of convenience, out of economies of scale. If I eat a cabbage from one of the great interior valleys of California, which has been trucked across the country to me in Washington, D.C., there are lands that used to be farmlands just a short drive from where I'm sitting that are no longer used for farming. They're used for suburban sprawl, and they're used for horse farms and various other purposes. Once upon a time, they did grow cabbages, but we've centered the production of certain grades of crop in certain places and let the truck do the rest of the work. And it has had some effect on what shape the cabbage is in, how long it's been out of the ground, various variables involved in a piece of produce by the time it gets into my kitchen produce keeper, the drawer.
Well, I'm not as down on fruits and vegetables from the Central Valley in California. Most of them are refrigerated immediately after they're picked. They're shipped immediately after they're refrigerated. They are kept in a cold chain all the way to the distribution center and to the supermarket, where they will finally be put out on a chilled counter. They often experience less damage and deterioration than a cabbage that's picked at a small farm 20 miles away and isn't refrigerated. It's hauled to the farmer's market on a pickup truck, and then it's set out there under the sun, and anything in the hot sun loses its nutrient quality very quickly, not to mention its cosmetic appeal. We've found better ways to get fresh, nutritious products to consumers in parts of the country that don't have the year-round sunshine, that don't have the labor force that the Central Valley has in California. And the example from my part of the country is asparagus. I'm in Massachusetts, and the Pioneer Valley in Western Massachusetts used to be known as the asparagus capital of the world because they had perfect, well-drained, sandy soil. And asparagus, not only for the city of Boston, but for much of the East Coast of the United States, was being grown in the Pioneer Valley. Well, the sandy soil is still there, but no one's growing asparagus in Western Massachusetts anymore because asparagus is it's a perennial crop, and the shoots pop up at different times, and it has to be hand harvested. It has to be hand cut. You can't mechanize the harvest. And that means stoop labor. That means punishing stoop labor, and wages in Western Massachusetts just keep going up and up and up and up. And so the asparagus growers left Massachusetts. Many of them are now in Central and South America, where you can still find people who are willing to do that very hard work at an acceptable price. Now, you could probably write a novel about the justice or injustice of that outcome. But in the end, in Boston, I get asparagus. I wouldn't otherwise.
But here's part of the sort of embedded paradox in the chain of events that you've just been describing. If we go back to the Pioneer Valley, sitting on either side of the Connecticut River in Western Mass, there are a lot of small farms there now. And who are the farmers? Young, well-educated people who've decided to devote themselves to making almost curatorial crops that they sell in Northampton, the home of Smith College, or the Saturday morning farmers market in Amherst. And they sell them for a very high markup to a very small set of customers. These are people who are seeking out this food. This is never going to be an answer at scale to America's hunger. But do we learn something that's important to know about markets, about the economies of different kinds of food, about the chain of possession from farm to table? Is it worth keeping those kinds of farms alive, in part because they're a laboratory for the ways Americans eat today and will eat in 5 and 10 years?
Yeah, I think we learned something from the flourishing of these kinds of farms in Western Massachusetts. We learn about the value of what in my book I call multi-agriculturalism. I don't want one kind of farm. I'm pleased to see the wide variety of farms that we have in the United States. We have the Department of Agriculture defines a farm as an operation that sells at least $1,000 worth of product every year, which is a pretty low threshold. But with that threshold, they designate farms, and most of the farms that are officially qualified as farms produce very little food. They are retirement farms, hobby farms, part-time farms. They're agritourism farms that specialize in barn weddings. Some of them are small little CSA organic farms that serve the kind of clientele you're describing in Western Massachusetts. And I think that's valuable. It gives people opportunities to pursue a lifestyle, to honor values, to serve a clientele that attracts them. But we shouldn't fool ourselves about the amount of food that these farms produce. In the United States today, 85% of the food we produce is produced on just 7% of our farms. And that's the much larger industrial scale farms with annual sales of $500,000 or up. New England is an important place to be, to appreciate the divergent sizes and production results of farming systems in the United States. If you look at all of the farms, the large and small farms in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, the total product sales of all of those farms amounts to only about 1% of total product sales from the rest of the country.
Amazing.
So what we have in New England is a style of farming. It's in a sense, it's lifestyle farming, and it it holds together rural communities. It's an important part of the cohesion of rural America, including the communities you're describing. It's socially valuable, but we can't imagine that this is how we're going to provision ourselves in the years ahead, particularly in the cold winter months.
But it does have some influence, I would suggest, on the way we eventually eat. There are things that I could find in a produce section in a Walmart or a Target or a Giant or a Safeway, one of the big national supermarket chains, that I first came across as a food item at a farmer's market years earlier. They introduce varieties of greens, varieties of food that the public gets a taste for. It's almost a proof of concept, a pilot for something that eventually takes on some relevance as a food item in the wider marketplace. And its price point migrates down too, once it's pilot tested in this way.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And these local farms are experimental in other ways. They look around and they see the kinds of fruits and vegetables that are an important part of diets, for example, in Asia. And they say, hey, I can grow Chinese bitter melon here in the United States. No one's eaten it traditionally, but now I can find it in my local produce market, grown on American farms, not imported from China. So you're right. There's an experimental dimension to all this.
Well, your thesis in the book is more challenging and more difficult than I've made out so far. So let's grasp some of the various nettles that you've laid out for us, and go back to Africa, because Africa is organic, local, and slow, and has had in recent years challenges. It's one of the last places in the world where people still have large families. It is one of the few places in the world that will have a sizable peak strength and vitality time of life labor force in mid-century, one of the last places on earth where there'll be a big, big labor pool of people in their 20s and 30s in mid-century, and a place that's had trouble feeding itself. Now there are 1.25 billion people on the African continent, and a lot of the food they eat day in and day out is imported. It must be because of the agriculture that's practiced there. So how can we prescribe organic and local for ourselves and want something different for Africa?
Well, that's the question I opened my book with, in a sense. African agriculture is essentially unimproved. African smallholder farmers don't have any of the things that farmers in the rest of the world have used to make their labor more productive, increase their income, and escape poverty. African smallholder farmers don't have access to fertilizer. They seldom have access to improved seeds. They don't have veterinarian medicine for their animals. They don't have irrigation. They don't have electricity. They don't have mechanical power. For the most part, they don't have these things because they're essentially cut off from the modern economy by an inadequate rural infrastructure. Most African farm households live more than 2 kilometers from the nearest all-weather road. So in the rainy season, they can't take their goods out to the market, and they can't bring fertilizer and seeds in to plant for the next season. They're sealed off from prosperity. They're forced to produce much of their own food. In Ethiopia, poor rural households produce 60% of the food that they consume themselves. Well, this sounds wonderfully self-sufficient, but their productivity is so low, they have to work all day long to do this, which means they don't have time to do anything else, to make money doing anything else. And so they're in a perfect poverty trap. We need to understand that farmers in the rest of the world were fortunate when their governments created a rural infrastructure of all-weather roads, when their governments put in rural electricity, when their governments invested in irrigation projects. Governments in Africa haven't done this. Governments in Africa, unfortunately, lavish all of their resources onto urban dwellers and leave the countryside, for the most part, neglected. And until that, in India in the 1970s, when that country started making large investments in agriculture and had considerable success, it was devoting 20% of its total public budget to agriculture. In Africa today, most governments devote less than 5% of their public budget to agriculture, even though 50 to 60 to 70% of their citizens depend on farming and herding cattle for income and employment.
It is a hard thing to be a farmer in Africa, whether you're growing for the marketplace or just for your family. But even those farmers who try to climb a couple of rungs up the ladder have some structural challenges that are not easily gotten around. Credit is a difficult road for a lot of African families, and they are sort of strung out from loan to loan. They live from loan to loan for inputs, for seed, and it's very hard for them to get ahead. Land tenure is very difficult in many places in Africa. So you can't even use your land as collateral to get any of the other things, either in equipment or in inputs that you really need. It's scary to think about what another 500 million people might eat in another 40 years there.
Yeah.
Will that need sort of force the change just because there's no choice?
Well, that's a good question. The additional dimension here that has to be acknowledged is that most African farmers are women. And they may not have authority to make decisions on the farm because the property rights are all in the hands of men. They may have to wait until their husband returns from the market town where he's found a better way to make money in order to make a decision to cut down a tree or to slaughter a goat. They just simply don't have the authority that's needed to make productive decisions on the farm because of their subordinate legal status. Those are things that should be changed as well.
One of the most irritating arguments that swirled around cultivators in the developing world has to do with genetically modified organisms, so-called GMOs. If they grow them and get better yields, they really do have to stay close to home because export markets won't buy what they produce. When growers in developing countries use GMO crops, they'll find a lot of markets close to them, even as an additive or an ingredient in food that winds up being processed and used for other purposes. Yet, GMOs make it possible for the hundreds of millions across the developing world to be more secure, to be sure that they're going to have enough to eat every day. It's a real conundrum.
Yeah, the regulation of GMOs is a fascinating problem. And what I find most fascinating about it is that most countries in the developing world have not yet made it legal for their farmers to plant any genetically modified seeds for basic food staple commodities. Nowhere in the developing world, in fact, nowhere in the world, is it legal for farmers to plant GMO varieties of wheat. Nowhere is it legal for farmers to plant GMO varieties of rice. The two most important staple crops in the world are not being grown commercially anywhere in a GMO form because governments have adopted regulatory systems that, that make this against the law. This is something that surprises people. They've been told that GMOs promoted by powerful biotechnology companies are being forced down the throats of farmers and people in the developing world. But this is actually an interesting case in which the campaigns against these companies and against GMOs have won a spectacular victory when it comes to food crops for direct human consumption. Now, a lot of GMO crops are grown in much of the Western Hemisphere for animal feed or for industrial purposes like cotton or yellow maize, yellow corn that's turned into ethanol for auto fuel. But GMOs for direct human food consumption, there practically aren't any being grown anywhere. A little bit of papaya in Hawaii, a little bit of white corn in the Republic of South Africa, some sugar beets, but otherwise almost nothing.
Well, I wonder if GMOs would have a better time if we could have a better conversation about what is and what isn't. People make distinctions. If a form of tough grass that grows in arid lands, drought resistant, is spliced into a variety of wheat to help it grow in areas with increasingly unreliable rains, people look at that differently from pulling a gene that keeps fish from freezing solid in Arctic waters and putting it in strawberries so that you can grow them in the snow. I think there's a more subtle, more nuanced conversation to be had around GMOs. Just everything we eat is pretty much not a plant that occurred in this natural state that we're eating it in originally. Everything's been modified over time to become a commercial food crop. There's no wild cow that we could go hunt and put in a pen and then eventually turn into steak. There is no wild pig that resembles anything like the pig that you'll find in a big hog operation in Iowa. Those have been genetically modified for eons.
Yeah, even wild onions don't exist anymore. They're extinct. So no, you're exactly right. Opposition to GMO foods, I think, is best explained by noticing that the benefits of this technology were intended for farmers. The first generation of GMO crops that came on the market were designed to give farmers a chance to reduce their costs by reducing what they had to spend on insecticide sprays and by reducing the number of herbicide sprays they had to use. It was a way to protect crops against weeds and insects at lower cost to farmers. But there was no benefit, practically no benefit at all for consumers, the end user. Genetically modified soybeans didn't taste any better. They didn't prepare any better. They weren't any more nutritious. And they weren't noticeably cheaper by the time the soybean oil was mixed into a product on the shelf. The slightly lower price of the GMO soybean that had been harvested was lost completely. So consumers saw no benefit. And this meant that it was easy for critics of GMOs to persuade them to reject the product. I contrast this to the use of genetic engineering in medicine, where the same recombinant DNA technology was being used at about the same time in the 1990s to produce a wide array of new biologic drugs. They were manufactured using the genetically modified ovary cells of Chinese hamsters. You'd think that would have an ugh factor for consumers, but no, because these were These are pharmaceutical products that delivered important and direct benefits to the final consumer. If you're getting a benefit, you're not going to be quite as nervous about the novelty of a product. If you're not getting a noticeable benefit, a novel product can seem much more anxiety-inducing.
Well, see, here I was. I had no idea why I was sticking sunflower seeds in my cheeks. Now I know. But, you talk about the campaigns against genetically modified food and about the lack of evidence for their harm. But, I think some of the resistance to GMOs is not assuaged. It's not addressed. It's not handled. It's just sort of dismissed. And that's a problem, because even when they're imprecise, or, to be less charitable, incorrect or totally wrongheaded, some of these food campaigns have put pressure in the pipe, put the vast food business on notice that they've got to respond in a way, whether it's trans fats or whether it's neonicotinoids and the harm that they may be doing to commercial bee operations. It's the dead zones at the mouth of the Mississippi River with all the runoff, killing all the life where the Mississippi runs into the Gulf of Mexico. The algae blooms in the western part of Lake Erie. These are all unintended consequences of industrial food, food produced at scale for a population that's huge. But instead of saying, hey, you've got a point, we dismiss these fears and concerns and anxieties rather than taking them head on. If you say, well, look, there's no proof that these things do you any harm, they actually do a lot of good, so leave me alone, that's one answer. Another answer might be, look, we'll segregate these crops and we will work our way through, and we'll talk you through, and the industry will adapt and help start a dialogue with eaters and buyers of these things. I just think we have such dispersed responsibility and such dispersed accountability in the massive way we're trying to feed what'll soon be 8 billion people, that it's hard to point to any one person and say, you're the guy who's making my life crazy because I can't figure out how to eat well and not have any second thoughts about the things that I buy when I'm in the supermarket.
Yeah. One question that occurs to me when I look at this problem is who should be determining the outcome? I mentioned that when it comes to GMO food crops, the companies that tried to put them on the market have essentially failed completely because of resistance from consumers in industrial countries, beginning in Europe, but in many other industrial countries as well. As countries put stifling regulations in place, and developing countries adopted the same regulations, thinking that was the best practice. So now these crops are not in the field anywhere. But if you're one of those maize farmers in Africa, and if your crop is being destroyed by stem borers, and if you had BT maize, you could control those insects without any insecticide sprays, maybe you've lost something here when it's not legal for you to plant that crop. Or let's say you're a child in Bangladesh, and you are not getting enough beta carotene, and you run the risk of vitamin A deficiency blindness. The fact that a vitamin A rich variety of rice known as golden rice has been sitting on the shelf for 20 years because it's not legal to grow anywhere, because it's a GMO. Maybe you have an interest in that. You have to constantly be putting yourself in the position of people outside the advanced industrial world, I think, to get a full picture of what's at stake when a new technology is as completely rejected as GMO food crops have been.
Let me remind all of you listening that you can join the conversation with Professor Paarlberg. Please put your questions into the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We'd love to hear from you, and he'd love to take your questions. Is this a salvageable proposition? You're talking about these wonderful developments that are bottled up, in effect. Right now, it's a valor to put no GMOs on your packaging, to promise that there are no genetically modified organisms in the things you sell. How can we unleash these advances, but in a way that's responsible and builds confidence and builds market, instead of feels like it's being shoved onto the buying public?
Yeah, if you'd asked me that question 3 years ago, I would have said, well, it's too late for GMOs, recombinant DNA technologies, bringing genetic traits in from unrelated species. The opposition to that is so complete. We shouldn't try to reverse that social judgment, even though it might bring harm to some low-income farmers and consumers in the developing world. I would have said, fortunately, we have a next generation of new crop biotechnologies that don't bring in foreign genes from unrelated species. It's called gene editing. These crops are called CRISPR crops. It's a biotechnology method that mimics natural mutations that take place all the time in plants and animals. You can with considerable precision either edit out or up influence genetic traits with enormous precision using this technology. It was first done in 2012, I think, in the laboratory. And it's much less expensive than recombinant DNA technologies. It's far more precise. It has enormous potential. I would have said this won't bring the same kind of reaction because there's no foreign DNA in these gene edited crops. But I was wrong because in 2018, the European Court went against the advice of its own Advocate General and said that gene edited crops ought to be regulated as though they were rDNA GMO crops. So these new gene edited crops will have to be approved one at a time. They will have to be segregated in the marketplace from non-gene edited crops. There'll have to be an audit trail. The operators in the marketplace that handle these crops will have to keep a record for 5 years of every gene edited crop they got and from whom and to whom they sold it and when. These are the stifling regulatory requirements that drove GMOs out of the marketplace completely. And so now there's a chance that gene edited crops are going to be driven out of the market as well. So we may have only seen the first act in a two-part drama of whether the world is ready for modern crop biotechnology. It may not be, and I think we would lose something in that result.
I misspoke a moment ago when I suggested you use the chat function. Please use the Q&A function to add your question to the queue. George asks, we already confiscated 1/3 of Earth's land mass from other species and will soon have a half. Long ago, we took most arable land. Now we pour nitrates into ever more desert and empty rivers, lakes, and aquifer. Considering also our pollution, effluence, and again, growing wars over land and resources the still overpopulating cultures bring, isn't it time to reduce population, arbitrarily 90%, and remove all those problems by doing so?
By 90%. Okay. Do we all roll the dice and take and take a 9 in 10 chance of being eliminated? and who would impose this outcome? I don't like outcomes that could only be achieved through the use of authoritarian government. I'm a political scientist. And so I want to know what kind of political authority is compatible with various suggested and proposed outcomes. And any scheme to reduce population, I think, is incompatible with the kind of values I have on how societies should be governed. And it's, of course, something that's been tried before. China in the 1970s, worried about rapid population growth, decided to adopt a one-child family policy. And there's an authoritarian regime. They could do it. And they did it. And the parents who had to limit themselves to only one child would sometimes, tragically, if that first child was a daughter, she would be killed. They wanted sons. Culturally, sons were important. And so it led to female infanticide. When the government of India, also in the 1970s, decided it should restrict population growth, it instituted a system for paying people to be sterilized. And even that malfunctioned because the government workers who were implementing this program, who were mostly Hindu, implemented the program heavily in Muslim communities. And it became an explosive question between Hindus and Muslims in India, and the idea was quickly dropped. So it's possible to imagine a world with many fewer people making many fewer resource demands, but I can't imagine an acceptable way to engineer that result.
Even in Avengers Endgame, it has a very bad outcome. Francesco asks, what is your view on the more and more popular technologies applied to alternative ingredients, proteins that are plant-based or eggless and others, versus their animal-based options? Also, are they going to be an option for emerging markets?
Well,
you write extensively about this in the book, by the way.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of plant-based imitation meats, and I'll be hoping soon for cell-cultured meat products as well. These are products that do not require the feeding and slaughter of billions of animals, and that I think it's a plus for animal welfare. It's also a plus for human medicine because of the antibiotics we use in the livestock industry that can compromise the value of antibiotics used in human medicine. And most of all, it's a plus for the environment. If you consume an Impossible Burger or a Beyond Burger in place of a real beef patty, the carbon footprint, I should say the greenhouse gas footprint of your meal will be reduced by 90%. Beef cattle are ruminant animals, so they belch out large quantities of methane, which is a serious, which is a greenhouse gas far more potent than CO2. One of the best things we can do to protect the climate is to raise fewer ruminant animals, and these plant-based imitation meats are one way to do that. I don't know exactly how fast it's going to scale up. Right now, it's growing quite quickly. Impossible Foods increased its production 6-fold over the last year. Their goal is not to just be a niche product. With demand booming, they actually cut their prices twice. They intend to undercut the market for real animal-based beef products. They want to replace animals as the leading technology in providing tasty burger products, both for home preparation and in restaurants. We don't know exactly how fast it's going to go, but in dairy markets, plant-based milk substitutes from coconuts, from almonds, from rice have already taken over 13% of the fluid milk market. We have plant-based imitation eggs that are in wide use now. The science will make these products tastier and more affordable with every year that goes by. There's big investments going into this. I think it's going to be a part of our future. I mean, think about the fashion industry, which uses imitation fur now to make it less necessary to slaughter animals for their fur. The shoe industries have imitation leather. They don't have to slaughter animals for their hide anymore. I think this is an approach that makes all the sense in the world, and I'm all for it. I worry a little bit about the hesitation that I see on the part of some leaders in our new food movement. They don't like plant-based imitation meat products. Why not? Because they're processed.
Heavily.
Now, I understand, there's an aversion to processed foods. If you want whole foods that you prepare from scratch, it has a kind of an artisanal attraction to it. But if you let that opposition to processing get in the way of achieving real benefits for animal welfare, human health, and for the environment, then I think you're pushing your priors a little bit too hard, a little bit too far.
Carolyn asks, what would you say about the role of seed banks, particularly gene banks, in ensuring agrobiodiversity and nutrition in foods?
Well, they play an essential role. It's not a sufficient role by itself, because this is a very expensive way to preserve agricultural biodiversity. In order for seed banks to succeed, the seeds in the banks have to be propagated on a regular basis and renewed. You can't just leave them in there for 50 years or 100 years. So it's an expensive operation, but it's an important tool. It's an important tool in the toolbox, and I'm glad that there's been international support for seed banks through the International Agricultural Research System. We've built up a nice spread of these facilities around the world, and the attraction is that these are public goods, so you don't have to pay money to get access to the seeds in these banks. They're being managed as public goods.
Lauren asks, I saw the film Kiss the Ground, and it suggests the desertification of areas of the earth may be reversible, such as a large project in China that's highlighted in the film. Does your book address this opportunity by China or other countries, including the US, Australia, certain countries in Africa? Is desertification, which is going so fast in some places that you can almost watch it, reversible?
To a remarkable extent, you can repair even severe damage to croplands and to grazing lands. I mean, I live in New England, and most of the forests in New England today used to be agricultural land, often rocky and badly eroded agricultural land. When the US agricultural zone moved westward into the Ohio Valley and then farther west, New England reforested. In some cases, sloping lands that have been cut for timber are intentionally reforested with great success. Agricultural lands, I mentioned the Dust Bowl in the Southern Plains in the 1930s. That Dust Bowl is no longer a Dust Bowl. We returned those lands to their proper function, which is for grazing cattle. It's possible to to repair lands if you have the authority to manage their use, and also the increased productivity of modern agriculture allows you to produce the food that you need on much less land. I mentioned that today in the United States, we're producing 5 times as much corn as in 1940 on 20% less land. Agricultural land in the United States peaked in 1950, even though production has almost tripled since then. We're actually, by some accounts, already at peak pasture land globally. Pasture lands are expanding rapidly in some continents where modern livestock systems have not been introduced. But when you introduce modern livestock systems and bring feeds to cattle that are more confined, or instead of just cutting down more trees and grazing more land and going up the sloping lands, you can repair and restore lands that have been overgrazed, and in many parts of the world that's happening today.
Mary points out, I think the main issue is concern that GMOs aren't safe. But I have to say, those of us who have health concerns feel this may contribute to health issues. If we can confirm no health concerns, I suspect support may grow. Cancer is growing and would correlate it to issues with food production. How do we assure and communicate to the public that this isn't the case?
Yeah, well, it's obviously not been done yet because there are widespread anxieties, of course, to the present day that have driven the outcome that we see. I mean, my first inclination is to look to the scientific community, not corporate scientists, but the national science academies that have procedures for making decisions about these things. And if you look at what's been said about GMOs by the science academies, all the science academies in Europe, including the British Medical Association, the Royal Society in London, the French Academy of Sciences and Medicine, the German Academy of Science and Humanities, they've all said in writing that they've not been able to find any evidence of new risks either to human health or to the environment from any of the GMOs that have been developed for the market so far. Now, I know that that's not satisfying to people who want proof of safety. Critics will say, well, absence of evidence isn't the same thing as evidence of absence. But when you stop and think about it, an absence of evidence isn't proof of absence. But if you look for something for a long time and don't find it, that's at least evidence of absence. And so you have to make your own decisions. Now that we have mandatory labeling for genetically modified crops in the marketplace, you have a little more information than you used to. Everyone has to make up their own mind. I know that it's frustrating to crop scientists who work with biotechnology to encounter in some settings a follow the science mantra when it comes to climate change. In other settings, it's a follow the science mantra when it comes to COVID-19. But when it comes to agricultural biotechnology, that somehow gets pushed aside, and other values tend to be privileged. As I've said, I think what determines the difference between those different venues is the fact that people in rich countries, the ones who make the rules when it comes to how things are regulated, the ones who dominate markets because of their purchasing power, in rich countries where consumers don't really need any new agricultural technologies. Farmers are already productive and prosperous. They don't need any new food products. We're already well fed, and indeed we're overfed. In rich countries, it's easier to take a less scientific basis for drawing decisions when it comes to agricultural biotechnology than in these other areas.
There's so much more to talk about, whether it's high fructose corn syrup, taking fragile lands out of production, how we're going to feed 9 billion people by mid-century. We could go on forever. I'm going to end with Bibi, who asks, I plan on buying your book as soon as this program is over, but I wanted to know if you buy organic farmed food, or do you buy at the big grocery markets?
In the summertime, up in Maine, I go to the local farmers market and we buy organically grown foods. It's a social activity. When I go to local supermarkets in the Boston area, a surprising share of the produce items there to purchase are organic. And if the cucumbers in the organic section look better than the cucumbers in the conventional section, I'll get them. I know they're equally nutritious and equally safe. But the cucumbers in the organically grown produce does cost, on average, in the United States, about 54% more than conventional produce. So I'm not an advocate for pushing organically grown produce onto everyone in the market. The result would actually be problems with our diet, because low-income consumers wouldn't be able to afford as many produce items as they could if they can buy conventional.
Robert Paarlberg, thanks so much for joining us.
Okay, I can repeat the name of the book one more time. Resetting.
Well, I'm just about to.
You do it.
Robert Paarlberg's new book is Resetting the Table, straight talk about the food we grow and eat. And thanks to him for joining us, thanks to you, our audience. We know that a lot of us have Zoom fatigue, but you continue to show up, and that helps us bring you the programming you value. If you have ideas for topics you'd like us to cover as a live event or on the radio program, please email us at feedback@worldaffairs.org. This has been a co-presentation of World Affairs and the Global Philanthropy Forum. Please join World Affairs next Thursday, February 18th at 12:30 Pacific for Solar Winds and the Art of Cyber Warfare. New York Times reporters David Sanger and Nicole Perlroth explain how Russian hackers were able to use vulnerable software supply chains in a massive hack of 250 federal agencies and businesses. You can RSVP on our website at worldaffairs.org. If you register for the event before February 14th, you can request a free screening pass from HBO to watch the documentary, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. Have a great rest of your week. Please remember to wear your masks so we can all stay healthy. Thanks again for joining us. I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.